Hello there, students. We're going to be talking today about the respiratory system. So first off, the overview of the system. And the system is a passage, kind of like tubes, all the way starting from the nasal cavity all the way down until it reaches the smaller air sacs or the alveoli in the lungs. And that's where exchange of gas is going to happen. Respiration is more than just being able to breathe, okay? There is a lot of exchange of gases happening. One exchange of gas happening in the lung tissue, and there's another set of gas exchange that is happening on the cellular level over in the capillaries, and we want to talk about both of these. So respiration really consists of these 5 steps. First off is ventilation, and ventilation is the process of breathing in and then breathing out, so inhalation and exhalation. External respiration means the exchange of gas that happens in the alveoli. So oxygen is going to be transported into the blood, into the capillary, while carbon dioxide is going to be expelled from the blood into the air sac. And then all of that oxygen is going to be transported. So we're going to transport gas between your lungs and your different body cells. This is the function of the cardiovascular system, where all of these gases are transported by blood. And then when oxygen is taken to your body cells, there is another exchange of gas that happens, and that's known as internal respiration, where in this exchange of gas, oxygen is going to be, will diffuse from the capillary to your cells, while carbon dioxide will go in the opposite direction. The cells are going to get rid of its carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide will diffuse from the cells into the capillaries. And then there's the process of cellular respiration, where the cells that just took that oxygen is going to burn glucose in the process of glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and so on. And that would be the last step of respiration. So you see here that respiration really involves all of these different steps. Respiration, as we said, happens on both a macroscopic level, which is a level that you can see by the naked eye, okay, and that would be the function of these different organ systems like the nose, the trachea, and so on. And then there's also the microscopic level of respiration, which would be that gas exchange that happens more at the cellular and molecular level. So these are microscopic levels. And respiratory system is going to provide oxygen for aerobic reactions. So all of the burn down of glucose, that requires oxygen. It is also going to eliminate carbon dioxide, which is one of the metabolites of aerobic respiration. And you want to really always coordinate the presence of carbon dioxide with an acidic medium. Okay, so you'll see here that it says it eliminates carbon dioxide in order to maintain the internal environment's pH, which is your hydrogen levels. So we need to understand the relationship between carbon dioxide and how that relates to your pH. There is an infamous formula, infamous reaction that happens in our bodies, and that would be where carbon dioxide doesn't usually stay as carbon dioxide. It usually combines with a molecule of water to make carbonic acid. Carbonic acid is then going to break down into hydrogen and HCO3, which is bicarbonate. So you'll see here that the making of carbonic acid, how we can kind of equate the presence of carbon dioxide with an acidic medium. Okay, so you want to think of carbon dioxide sort of a precursor, an acid precursor. So higher levels of carbon dioxide are going to lead to higher levels of acid in the body. In the aerobic reactions of cellular respiration, as we said, you need an oxygen in order to burn glucose and produce ATP. And then as a waste product, we're going to generate carbon dioxide, and that is why our cells can become acidic if we don't get rid of that carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is kind of considered as a toxin to the body, where it has to be carried off with the bloodstream and then exhaled with breathing. So what are the organs of the respiratory system? We divide them into upper respiratory tract and lower respiratory tract. So the upper respiratory tract organs would be the nose, the nasal cavity, and these paranasal sinuses. The pharynx that we talked about when we discussed the digestive system, and then the larynx. Okay, that's where the vocal cords are. So that, if when you go beyond that or below that level, now you're into the lower respiratory tract, and that would be the trachea or the windpipe, the bronchial tree, and that's when the trachea starts to branch off into different bronchi, and then the lung tissue. So at any upper respiratory tract infection would be in one of these. Lower respiratory tract infection would be in those. So first off, we'll talk about the nose and the nasal cavity. The nose is a space, the nasal cavity is a space right behind or beyond the nostrils. Okay, it's separated into a right and a left part by the nasal septum. Okay, the nasal septum is actually made by different bones. Okay, there we go. So this right here shows the different parts of the nasal septum. The upper part, upper posterior part, so this is the nostril and this is the back of the nose. The posterior part of the nasal septum is made by the perpendicular plate of ethmoid on top and then the vomer bone on the bottom, while the anterior portion of the nasal septum is basically cartilage. It is not a bony structure. We also have on the lateral walls, there are nasal concha, which are basically kind of like shelves that are found on the lateral surface of the nose, and those are responsible for circulating the air inside of the nasal cavity before it gets in to the lungs. As it circulates in the nasal cavity, we moisten it, okay, and we also warm the air up a little bit. So we'll also take a look at these concha. There is the superior nasal concha on top, and then there's the middle and the inferior nasal concha. So these concha are different shelves that kind of protrude on the lateral walls. And then underneath each concha, there is a space, and that space is known as a meatus. So you have the superior, middle, and inferior meatus. And all of these structures are found on the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. The upper portion, that's where you'll find the olfactory receptors. So when we were talking about special senses, we said that the olfactory receptors, which again were chemoreceptors, those are found all the way up on the top portion of the nose. Okay, the whole nose is lined with pseudostratified ciliated epithelium, which is a mucous membrane, so it makes mucus in order to trap some of the germs and particles trying to come in. It's ciliated, and that cilia is going to help in getting rid of foreign bodies, again, trying to get into the body. And the nasal cavity functions, as we mentioned, to warm up and moisten and filter all of the incoming air. Here again, you can see, the different parts. We have not talked about the nostrils, which is basically the anterior opening of the nasal cavity. And there are hairs in that area, internal hairs that are also protect the entrance. As we go back towards the exit of the nose, that'll take you to the nasopharynx. More about the nasal cavity. Like I said, it's lined with pseudostratified, ciliated columnar epithelium. So you can see here the columnar epithelium with cilia on top, and these goblet cells, and all of these goblet cells again make mucus. It is pseudostratified, meaning that it looks like these are several layers, but it is actually just one layer. And the function, the cilia together with the mucus, those are really important as they work together, because the mucus is going to trap any foreign particles, and the cilia is going to sweep down. It makes this wavy or peristaltic movement that is going to sweep away anything that's been trapped in the mucus, and it actually takes it to the inside of the body. It does not push it out. It actually pushes it backwards towards the nasopharynx, and then it will be swallowed, and it will be destroyed by the hydrochloric acid found in the stomach. The nasal sinuses or the paranasal sinuses, these are cavities, okay, that are found in the skull. The skull, if it was just purely bone tissue, it would be a very hard bone. But what we actually have are different cavities that are full of air, and those cavities are all lined with mucous membranes, and they all open up into the nose, and that's why they kind of surround the nasal cavity. That's why they're known as the paranasal sinuses. So we have a frontal sinus, which would be right above the orbit. We also have the maxillary sinus, which is found in the maxilla, which is the cheekbone. We also have the ethmoidal air cells and the sphenoidal air sinuses. Okay, like I said, all of them are lined with mucous membrane. The sinus cavities are full of air. They should not be full of liquid. If they are, could be due to allergy or inflammation. And all of them drain their mucus and drain any discharge in them into the nasal cavity. Now for the pharynx, and again, we talked about the pharynx when we discussed the digestive system, so this is going to be kind of a quick review. We mentioned that it is a pathway for both air and food. It has three parts. So the part that opens up into the nasal cavity, that is known as the nasopharynx, and you will find the adenoids or the pharyngeal tonsils, and you could also find the opening of the auditory tube in the nasopharynx. While the part of the pharynx that opens up into the oral cavity, this part is known as your oropharynx, and the part that opens up into the larynx, that is known as the laryngopharynx. Air would be going towards the trachea, while food would be pushed backwards towards the esophagus. Now the larynx, that is the voice box. We have not discussed the larynx. It's part of the respiratory tract, and it is made out of muscles and cartilages. It is a whole framework of all of these connected together with different connective tissue and different muscles in order to produce sound. So let's introduce the cartilages that we have. We have three big single cartilages, so we only have one of these. The biggest one is the thyroid cartilage, and you'll see here right in the middle, it has these two plates that fuse in the middle to make that laryngeal prominence. In males, the laryngeal prominence is more enlarged and more prominent, and we also call it Adam's apple. We've got the cricoid cartilage, which would be underneath the thyroid. Okay, we only have one of those. And then we also have the epiglottis. This picture down here is a posterior view of the larynx, and you could see here the thyroid cartilage, the cricoid cartilage underneath it, and then you could get a better picture of the epiglottis. It kind of looks like a tongue or a spoon, and that is the epiglottis that has to bend down in order to cover the trachea so that when we eat, food doesn't get into the trachea. And then we've got three pairs of these smaller cartilages. All of them you'll see from the posterior view. So we have the arytenoid cartilage, and this is the triangular shaped cartilage. Right on top of it, you're going to see the smaller triangle, and that is known as a corniculate cartilage. And then there's a cuneiform cartilage, and that's not showing up here in this image. Again, you've got pairs, so you can find right and left of these, while the other cartilages are only single. Now, all of these cartilages are covered with mucous membrane, and that leads, so you can see here, this is the epiglottis, but covered now with this pink mucous membrane. And we have these two folds. So this is an upper fold, and this is a lower fold. The upper fold is also known as the false vocal cords, or the vestibular folds. The lower fold down here is known as the true vocal cords, or just known as the vocal cords, and these are the ones that are going to produce sound. So we, as you can see in this picture right here, we kind of open them and shut them so that when air is being passed through it, it produces these different sounds. The space between the two vocal cords is known as the glottis, and that is why this is known as the epiglottis, because it's above the glottic area. This is a real image from the vocal cords. These are your false or vestibular upper folds, while these are the true lower vocal cords. And if you look here, the space between them, that again is known as the glottis. And as you can see here, you are actually looking at the trachea. You can see the rings of the trachea. Now moving down into the trachea, that is a cylindrical tube. It's made out of these different cartilaginous rings, but they are not full circles. These are C-shaped rings. And you'll see here that the anterior part, you can see the cartilage. If you flip this and you look at it from a posterior view, there's no cartilage. It is replaced by smooth muscle fibers. It is also lined with ciliated mucous membrane with goblet cells. And as I said, you've got these C-shaped rings. There's 20 of them, and it's made out of hyaline cartilage, and it prevents the trachea from collapsing. So here again, you can see that C-shaped white hyaline cartilage, and at the very back, we have smooth muscles. Okay, so that is a C-section of the trachea. Okay, the tracheostomy, that would be making an incision or an opening into the trachea if somebody has something, that is lodged or that is preventing air from entering into the trachea. At the level up here in the larynx, for example, we can make an incision into the trachea. That incision is known as a tracheostomy, and insert a little tube so that air could get into the lungs. Now for the bronchial tree. So this trachea is going to start to branch off into bronchi. The main bronchi is known as your primary bronchus. So this is your right primary bronchus, and that's your left primary bronchus. And then each of these primary bronchi are going to start branching even further into secondary and then tertiary bronchi, and all the way until we reach what is known as the respiratory bronchiole, and then an alveolar duct, and then the alveolus. And this is where the actual exchange of gas is going to happen. So we'll take a look at the breakdown of the bronchial tree. This is kind of a mold of the bronchial tree. We start off with the trachea, then we have a primary bronchus. On the left side, there should be two secondary bronchi, because the left lung has two lobes, while on the right side, the right lung has three lobes, and therefore we have three secondary bronchi. The reason the left lung only has two lobes is that because the heart is lodged right over here, and there's no space for that third lobe. Okay. Now for the division of the bronchi, so we already talked about the primary bronchus, secondary and then tertiary bronchi, and then we're going to go into the bronchioles. So there's an intralobular bronchiole, terminal bronchiole, and respiratory bronchiole. Those are going to take you down to your last part, these AAAs, the alveolar ducts, alveolar sacs, and then all the way to the alveoli. And this is kind of like a little thing to remember. We have primary, secondary, tertiary bronchi, and then intralobular, terminal, so IT, R would be respiratory, and then AAA would be your alveolar ducts, sacs, and alveoli. The only thing is that exchange of gas is not going to happen until you actually reach your the very terminal parts of the respiratory pathway. All the way until the terminal bronchiole, there is cartilage and there are smooth muscles. Okay, that is gradually going to disappear until you reach the alveoli. In the alveoli, there's no cartilage whatsoever. There's no smooth muscle fibers, and it is only made out of a thin layer of simple squamous epithelium, which is the one layer of that flat cells. Okay, and that's where exchange of gas is going to happen. So the function of all of that bronchial tree is to basically bring in oxygen or bring in air until it reaches the alveoli. Okay, no exchange of gas happens in these. These are just pathways for air to reach the alveolus. Now, the structure of your respiratory tubes, we kind of already talked about this. So we already know that the trachea is made out of these cartilaginous C-shaped rings. In the back, they are made out of smooth muscle fibers. And then as it branches off, the cartilage tends to decrease. When you reach your bronchioles, there is no more cartilage. It is basically connective tissue, or basically epithelium and smooth muscle fibers. And then the smooth muscle fibers tend to gradually also disappear, okay, until we reach the very tip where we reach your alveolus, and that's only made out of simple squamous epithelium. As for the lining, the epithelial lining of the respiratory tubes, that is also changing. So in the larger tubes, in order to trap things trying to get in, that is lined by pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. And then it starts to flatten down a little bit. Okay, so this columnar epithelium will be replaced by simple cuboidal when you reach the respiratory bronchioles. And when you reach the alveolus, that's where it becomes even flatter in that you only have that simple squamous epithelium. So this right here is the alveolus, and you can see here that simple squamous epithelial lining. This is where the air would be. And you can see the blood flow. So this is the deoxygenated blood coming from the heart, coming from the right side of the heart, with more carbon dioxide and less oxygen. And as it flows, it is going to get rid of the carbon dioxide, and oxygen is going to diffuse into these capillaries. So the exchange of gas that happens at this level, this external respiration, where oxygen diffuses into the capillaries and carbon dioxide diffuses into the air sac. And that keeps on going until on the other side, you have now this oxygenated blood, okay, oxygen-rich blood that is going to go to the left side of the heart so that it could get pumped by the left ventricle to the rest of the body. Now we're going to talk about the lungs, and the lungs are very spongy tissue. They're found in the thoracic cavity right above the diaphragm, and in the middle, between them, you'll find the heart and the mediastinum. The mediastinum has here the trachea. It also has your primary bronchi. As I mentioned, the left lung has 2 lobes, while the right lung has 3 lobes because it has more space. Remember, the heart is in this area, so the left doesn't have space for that 3rd lobe. You can see what is known as the hilum of the lungs. Remember when we talked about the liver, we said that the hilum is the area where things enter and exit out of any organ. Okay, so the hilum is found on the medial surface of the lungs, and you'll find here the bronchi entering. You can also find the blood supply, the nerves, and the lymphatic tissue, kind of going in and out of the lungs. The lung is surrounded by a serous sac, and that is known as the pleura. You guys should already know about this. So the 2 layers of the pleura, we have the parietal layer, and that is found you'll find that on the chest wall, while the internal layer is known as the visceral pleura, and that is right on top of the lungs. You literally have to peel it off the lung tissue. And the space between them would be your intrapleural space, which is full of intrapleural fluid. When I say full, I don't mean that there's a lot of it. Okay, it's a very, very thin layer of serous watery fluid known as the intrapleural fluid. Now for a little clinical application, how does cigarette smoking affect the respiratory system? Okay, so whether you're an actual smoker or you are you're getting it because somebody else is smoking, which would be environmental tobacco smoking, both of them can lead to these same effects on the respiratory system. So first off, the cilia that is supposed to be, pushing or trapping things, foreign particles as they try to get into the body, those are going to be paralyzed, okay, and then they will eventually be damaged. These goblet cells are constantly being irritated by that smoke and by all of the chemicals that are in cigarettes, and that leads to that chronic cough. So because of all of that mucus being produced, it has to be coughed up, and that is commonly referred to as smoker's cough. Okay, and because of that, there is a higher risk of getting respiratory tract infections. That chronic cough can lead to chronic bronchitis. So there is a chronic irritation and chronic inflammation of the bronchi. Eventually this could lead, over the years, this could lead to the damage of the alveolar walls, leading to emphysema. Emphysema is basically where the alveoli are just full of air and they cannot collapse. You cannot deflate them. So usually our alveoli or our air sacs are kind of like balloons. They can inflate and deflate because they are elastic. They have elastic tissue. In emphysema, the alveoli lose that elasticity so that you could fill them up with air, but there is no way for that air to get out. Okay. They would have what is known as a barrel chest, and I'm going to ask you guys to kind of Google what a barrel chest looks like, and that is known as emphysema. Okay, because of all the chemicals and the carcinogens that are in there, lung cancer can develop in about 20% of smokers. Now, other lung irritants that we could potentially get exposed to, and this is why a personal and an occupational history is really important. Okay, you really want to ask your patients what do they do for a living, because they could be exposed to different things and that might explain some of the signs and symptoms that you're seeing. So asbestosis is a mineral that is found or used to be found in walls and in buildings. These are little fibers that can lead to scarring of the lung tissue. It can lead to dyspnea, which is shortness of breath. It could eventually lead to mesothelioma, which is a cancer of the pleura. Berylliosis would be due to the exposure to an element known as beryllium. Okay, beryllium is found in scrap metal, in fiber optics, for instance. Exposure to those dusts could lead to scarring of the lung tissue as well, and dyspnea too. Air pollution. So not only, do you want to ask about that, but you kind of want to ask exactly where do they live. Some areas are more polluted than others. And so you could have these little airborne pollutants that could reach the alveoli and cause irritation. So you'll find in these areas that incidence of asthma would be higher. You could either find, allergies, generally speaking, so eye irritation and lung irritation at a higher rate. And even, occupants of certain zip codes would have higher risks of heart disease and lung cancer. Now, how do we breathe? Okay, so we want to kind of get into the physiology of breathing. Breathing, this is what we call ventilation, which is the basic inhalation or exhalation, or inspiration and exhalation, however you want to call them. Okay, so one breath in and one breath out, that is known as the respiratory cycle. Okay, and in order for us to inhale, okay, there has to be a difference in pressure. You want to think that there are two different pressures that are kind of playing out here. So there's the atmospheric pressure, which is on the outside of the body, and then there is the pressure inside of the lungs. Okay, so we have the intrathoracic pressure, or the alveolar pressure, which would be a pressure inside of the alveoli. In order for air to be inhaled, okay, so that we can inhale the air, the pressure on the outside has to be more than the pressure on the inside, and that will push air into the lungs. you kind of want to think of it like the syringe. Okay, when you want air to come in, you have to pull down that, you need to pull this down so that negative pressure develops inside of the syringe, and that leads to air flowing into the syringe. That's the same thing that we do here. In inhalation, the diaphragm, which is now curved, is going to flatten down a little bit. That will decrease the pressure inside of the lungs. Now the atmospheric pressure out here is higher, and that is going to push air into the lungs. This relationship is known as Boyle's law. Boyle's law states that there is an inverse relationship between pressure and volume, meaning that when the volume of something increases, the pressure inside decreases. So again, when this diaphragm flattens down, that is going to increase the volume of the lungs. According to Boyle's law, when you increase the volume, pressure goes down, pressure decreases, and that now the atmospheric pressure is higher, and that is going to push air into the lungs. The opposite is going to happen during exhalation, and we'll see kind of like how that occurs. So in inhalation, you have to decrease the intraalveolar pressure, and that again happens by the contraction of the diaphragm. So you see here the diaphragm is dome shaped, and then when it contracts, it becomes flattened down. You can see here that the lung volume has increased, and that decreases the pressure inside the alveoli. That decrease in pressure is going to push air from the atmosphere into the alveoli. This is what happens during normal or quiet inspiration. So you're at rest, your diaphragm is doing the work. Okay. Sometimes we might even need those external intercostals, but the diaphragm is definitely your main inspiratory muscle. Okay, if you need deep or forced inspiration, so to take a deep breath in, you're going to need more muscles to work. And those are known as the accessory muscles of inspiration. And those are the sternocleidomastoid. So this muscle right here in the neck, sternocleidomastoid, that is going to pull up the chest. You also have the scalene muscles and the pectoralis minor muscle. All of these are considered your muscles of maximal inspiration. Again, normal inspiration, you're going to be using your diaphragm, maybe the external intercostals. Maximal inspiration would be your SCM, scalenes, and pec minor. What we didn't talk about is the presence of surfactant. So under normal conditions, alveoli are surrounded by interstitial tissue. That interstitial tissue is made out of water mainly, and water has the tendency to compress the alveoli. It is that water pressure is going to want to make the alveoli collapse. And in order to prevent that, our alveoli make a chemical known as surfactant. That surfactant prevents the alveoli from collapsing due to surface tension. So your major events in inspiration would be the diaphragm contracting, and that gets its impulse from the phrenic nerve. Okay, when that dome-shaped diaphragm moves downwards, the thoracic cavity expands, so you've increased the volume of the thoracic cavity, and according to Boyle's law, when you do that, that is going to decrease the pressure in the alveoli. That decrease in intraalveolar pressure, less than the atmospheric pressure, is going to force the air into the alveoli, and the lungs fill with air. Now, how do we expire that? Expiration is a passive process, okay? This is, again, at rest, okay? So the alveoli have lots of elastic tissue, and it's because of the elastic recoil of the lung tissue that is going to lead to pretty much just deflating the alveoli. Okay, so that combination between the elastic recoil of the lung tissue together with the surface tension that already wants the alveoli to collapse, that is going to deflate the alveoli. Okay? That again happens at rest. During forced expiration, so if you're asked to kind of, you're trying to blow candles, okay, you're going to have to use more muscles, and those would be your internal intercostals, which are the muscles in between the ribs. And you can also use the abdominal muscles in order to force air out of the lungs. So here you can see in normal expiration, that is basically by the elasticity of the lungs and also by the surface tension. Well, in maximal expiration or forced expiration, you'll start using the abdominal muscles and the internal intercostal muscles. So what are the major events in expiration? Basically, the diaphragm and the external muscles are going to relax. Okay, due to the elastic recoil of the lung tissue, that is going to compress the alveoli and push the air out of the lungs. Now your pressure in the alveoli will be higher than the atmospheric pressure, and that's going to push air or force air out of the lungs. Now a little bit about these different respiratory volumes and capacities. This is important for both lecture and lab. Okay, as we breathe, there are different amounts of air going in and out, and it's important to understand, which one is which and kind of the clinical implication of these. In order to measure these different air volumes, we use what is known as a spirometer. Okay, the process is known as spirometry, but the actual machine that we use is known as a spirometer. And you hand it over to the patient and you ask them to first breathe normal, so take a normal breath in and out at rest. That is known as the tidal volume. Okay, so breathing in and out at rest with no effort, okay, that again is known as your tidal volume, kind of like a wave, a tidal wave. Okay, if you ask them to take normal breath and then inhale as much as they can. So the amount of air that they take in after a normal breath is known as the inspiratory reserve volume. Meaning, how much reserve space do I have in my lungs to inhale extra air after a normal inhalation? Okay, so I really wish at this point that we were together in class so we can kind of act this out together. But pretend that you take a normal breath in, and then you inhale as much as you can. That inspiratory, that extra air that you took in is known as your inspiratory reserve volume. So you're not going to use it unless you need it, and that's why it's known as the reserve volume. Okay? Try to compare that to the expiratory reserve volume. So that is the amount of air that you can push out of your lungs after a normal exhalation. So again, you exhale normally, and then you try to push air out of your lungs as much as you can. That amount of air that you exhaled extra after a normal breath out is known as your expiratory reserve volume. Okay? At the end, there is going to be some air left inside of the lungs. So no matter how much you try to breathe out and how hard you breathe out, there's always a little bit amount of air that is always going to be left in the lungs, or we would have collapsed our lungs. Okay, that is known as the residual volume. So the residual volume is always going to remain in the lungs, no matter how much you try to get it out. Now, if you add all three of these, your expiratory reserve, plus the tidal volume, plus the inspiratory reserve, that is known as the vital capacity. So the vital capacity, this is, again, think of blowing candles. So you take a deep breath in, and then you blow out as hard as you can. This is the test that is of the most important clinically, where we ask the patients to do exact this. As we just did right now. You ask them to inhale as much as they can and then to exhale as hard as they can, okay? Adding all three of these up will give you the vital capacity, meaning, how much can you exhale, the maximal amount of air that you can exhale after a maximal inhalation. Now for the inspiratory capacity, okay, notice this is an inspiratory capacity, which is different from the inspiratory reserve. So the reserve means in addition to what you can do normally. The inspiratory capacity would be adding both of these together. So an inspiratory capacity is your inspiratory reserve volume plus the tidal volume. Your expiratory reserve plus the residual is known as your functional residual capacity. Everything, add up all of these different volumes together, that would be your total lung capacity, which is between 5 to 6 liters of air. Okay, so I'm going to recommend that you kind of write this down. Again, it's important for lecture or lab. Maybe listen to this later on again if you can. And if you have any questions, definitely let me know. Here you can see the different definitions for all of these different volumes and capacities. Don't worry about the actual numbers, okay? But you definitely want to know the different descriptions of what these are and how can you kind of solve these different solutions. So if you're asked like, the patient has a tidal volume of say 500 and an inspiratory reserve volume say of 600, I'm just making these numbers up, what would the, and an ERV or the expiratory reserve volume of, X, what is the vital capacity of that patient? So you want to know that if you add all those up, that will give you the vital capacity. Okay. Respiratory volumes, those can be measured by a spirometer, but we have no way really using the spirometer at least of measuring the residual volume. So remember the residual volume is what is left in the lungs. The spirometer can basically only measure air flowing through it. So since we cannot blow that air out of the lungs, the spirometer is not going to measure residual volume. And different capacities are calculated by combining two or more of these different respiratory volumes. Okay, now to these dead air spaces. So a dead air space basically means that there is no exchange of gas happening in this area. Some of this is normal. Okay, so remember in the bronchi, for example, in the primary, secondary, tertiary bronchi, all of that is normal. There is no exchange of gas happening in these areas. Okay, so there's no really function to it except for taking the air, kind of like a pipe, in order to take the air and until it reaches the alveolus, and that's where your exchange of gas happens. So there's an anatomic dead space. Okay, that is the air in the respiratory tract that remains in conduction structures. It does not reach the alveoli. For example, as I mentioned, the trachea, the primary bronchi, secondary bronchi, and so on. But we also have what are known as alveolar dead space. So remember, exchange of gas is supposed to happen in the alveoli. So alveoli should not be dead space, okay? Alveolar dead space is going to happen either because of a disease in the alveoli, okay, so say somebody has pneumonia, or a disease of the blood vessels. Okay, so remember the exchange of gas happens between an alveolus and a capillary. So meaning that there is a dead space in this area, that could be either a pathology in the air sac, like pneumonia, or a pathology in the capillaries. So maybe this person has a pulmonary embolus, which is a clot in the pulmonary vessels. Okay, so this alveolar dead space is something pathological. Your physiological dead space is both of these added together. So practically speaking, how much of your lungs is not working? That would be your anatomical dead space plus the alveolar dead space. Under normal circumstances where people are healthy, the anatomical dead space is equal to the physiological dead space. If somebody has pneumonia, Then their physiological dead space would be the anatomical, which is normal, plus those alveoli that are not working, so plus your alveolar. Now for these different ventilation rates. There's a minute respiratory volume or minute ventilation, and that is how much of the air, volume of air that is moved into the respiratory passages each minute. And we can calculate it by calculating the respiratory rate, so how many breaths per minute that person take, and multiply it by the tidal volume. Okay, since not all of that air reaches the alveoli, a lot of it, okay, remains in the physiological dead space, remains in the trachea, for example. So this is really not a very good representation of the function of the lungs. A better representation would be what is known as the alveolar ventilation rate, where we are now taking into consideration this physiological dead space and removing it out of the equation. Okay, so we're going to multiply the respiratory rate by the tidal volume, just as we did up here, but we are going to subtract the physiological dead space. So now we are really looking at ventilation in the areas of gas exchange. Okay, so this is again a better representation of what's going on in the lungs. By definition, it is the volume of air that reaches the alveoli per minute, okay? While this is the volume of air that reaches the respiratory passages, which really means nothing because a lot of the respiratory passages are dead space. Okay, so this is again a more important value clinically speaking. Now, we kind of talked a lot about respiratory movements, but we have what are known as non-respiratory air movements. So things that we do with the respiratory passage that is not breathing, okay? So for example, coughing and sneezing, these are things that we do in order to clear the air passages. We also have things that express emotions like laughing and crying. And then we have things that we don't really know what the function is, like hiccups, yawning. Okay, these are all non-respiratory movements that we perform, but we don't know why. Okay, so the ones that are used to clear the respiratory passages, again, coughing and sneezing, in both of them we take a deep breath. Okay, we close the glottis, and then the glottis is opened suddenly, and the air is forced out. Coughing helps clear up the lower respiratory passages, while sneezing helps clear up the upper respiratory passages. Okay, laughing and crying both are different expressions of different emotions. In both of them, we take a deep breath and then we release that breath in kind of a series of interrupted expirations. Hiccups, that is a spasmodic contraction, meaning continuous involuntary contractions of the diaphragm with closing of the glottis. Okay, again, we don't really know what the function of hiccups is. Yawning is a deep breath that we take in. There are lots of theories out there, but again, nothing has been established as what is the function of yawning. We know that it expresses, either boredom or that we're tired, but what does it do? What is the function of yawning? Speech, that is a very important non-respiratory movement. Okay, the air is going to be forced into the larynx, and with the movement of the vocal cords, those lower true vocal cords, and movement of the lips, tongue, and soft palate, we're going to be making these different sounds, and that allows for vocal communication. Now, some respiratory disorders, okay, and in both of these there was a decrease in ventilation, and for example, bronchial asthma or emphysema. So bronchial asthma is a hyperreaction. It's an allergic reaction to foreign bodies, foreign antigens that could be inhaled into the airway. It really is the response of the lungs. You can kind of break it down into three different things. There would be an increase in mucus production, inflammation of the airway, and contraction of the smooth muscles of the bronchi. All three of these are also known as bronchoconstriction. So that, all three of these are going to lead to narrowing of the airways, and that leads to the wheezing, kind of that whistling sound that happens. Okay. Emphysema is a different kind of disease, and we kind of already talked about that, where there is the loss of elasticity in the alveolar walls, and the walls are destroyed. So now again, the air sacs that used to function as a balloon where it could fill up with air and then deflate, that is no longer the case. Okay, so you have these alveoli that can only inflate without deflation. And in order to do that, there's a lot of effort on the patient's end in order to breathe. This is one kind of COPD. COPD stands for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which means that there is an obstruction in the lungs that prevents or makes it harder to breathe. Okay, chronic COPD can either be emphysema or chronic bronchitis, and sometimes it's a combination of both. Actually, usually it's a combination of both. Now, how do we control breathing? Okay, so breathing is something that happens involuntary. Okay, we don't have to remember to breathe. Okay, we can breathe when we're sleeping. It is a rhythmic thing that happens. It can happen even when we're unconscious. So how is it that these respiratory muscles are able to do so? But we can control breathing, okay? So although it is an involuntary act that happens when we're not conscious, our cerebral cortex still has the ability to take over and control it. So you can hold your breath, and you could, inhale deeply, exhale deeply, and so on. So we still have that upper hand. So the different respiratory areas, you'll find that the areas for respiration are all found in the brainstem. Okay, we have a group of center found in the pons, and that's known as the pontine respiratory group. And then we have two different centers in the medulla, known as, the one in the front is known as the ventral respiratory group, and then the one in the back is known as the dorsal respiratory group. Okay, again, both of these are in the medulla oblongata. So these are going to adjust different things in the breathing process. So we'll kind of take a look and see how this occurs. So your pontine respiratory group, that is the group that limits the duration of each inspiration. So you're going to start inhaling, keep on inhaling, and keep on going, but there has to be a point where we stop inhalation, okay? That turn off switch to stop inhalation is done by the pontine respiratory group, okay? So this is the group, or this is the center that limits the duration of each inspiration, okay? And then the medullary groups, the one in the front, the ventral group, is responsible for basic rhythm of breathing. So are we breathing regularly or irregular? That is the function of the ventral group. The dorsal respiratory group is responsible for the rate of breathing, so how fast or slow are we breathing, and the depth of breathing as well. Okay. So we'll see, you can see here the different, nerve fibers, again, kind of going mainly to the diaphragm, that phrenic nerve, mainly to the diaphragm in order to start the whole process. Now, a little bit about the gas exchange. So we talk about partial pressures and not pressure. So pressure means just how much oxygen, for example, is present. That is not going to really help us because we need a relative amount of gas. So let's say we have, 20% of gas or oxygen, or 5% of oxygen, or whatever, the numbers are. That gives us an idea of how much oxygen there is in relationship to the other gases. Okay, so that relative amount, that is known as the partial pressure, which is the amount of pressure that each gas contributes to your total pressure. Okay, it's which is obviously directly proportionate to the concentration. So again, your partial pressure is a much better representation than just how much oxygen there is. You want to think about how much, this amount of oxygen, how is it contributing to the pressure of air? So there are different factors. Since we breathe, anything in the body that happens has to be affected by different things. So the factors that affect breathing are, there's the partial pressure of oxygen, so how much oxygen is in our system, partial pressure of carbon dioxide, or PCO2, hydrogen ions, okay, and remember that again, carbon dioxide and hydrogen are very much related to each other. The degree of stretch of lung tissue, so basically how much air are we inhaling. The emotional state, so somebody happy or they're crying, so they are hyperventilating, and the level of physical activity. Okay, so when you're sitting at rest, you're obviously going to breathe at a lower rate as opposed to somebody exercising. They are going to be breathing faster. So all of these are different factors that affect the rate and depth of breathing. So one more time, the partial pressures of oxygen and carbon dioxide, your hydrogen levels in the body fluids, stretch of lung tissue, emotional state, and the physical activity levels. When we inhale, okay, we are going to stretch different receptors. Those are known as your mechanoreceptors. We also have other receptors that are chemoreceptors. So the mechanoreceptors are stretch receptors found in the lung tissue, while these chemoreceptors are either found in the central, so in the CNS, or in the peripheral parts, and those would be in the, not in the PNS, but I'll explain where they are. They're found in the arch of the aorta and in the carotids. Okay, and I just put up there that little equation for carbon dioxide where it combines with water to make carbonic acid, and then it further breaks down into hydrogen and HCO3. So again, this hydrogen ion is how we correlate acidity with carbon dioxide. So we'll take a look at the peripheral chemoreceptors. Your peripheral chemoreceptors are found in the arch of the aorta and in the carotids. They're known as the aortic bodies and the carotid bodies. These are just little receptors that pick up changes in chemistry, hence the name chemoreceptors. And the peripheral chemoreceptors basically pick up change in the partial pressure of oxygen, or PO2. Okay, and they're kind of strategically put. So you have have these chemoreceptors that are right on the arch of the aorta before the blood goes to any of the organs. And then you also have these very strategic locations where before the blood gets into the internal carotids and into the brain. Okay, so these are very strategic areas where these chemoreceptors are found. Okay, any decrease in the pressure of oxygen, that means that there's not enough breathing, and that is going to stimulate breathing. It's going to stimulate the alveolar ventilation, which is basically stimulating the breathing rate. Okay, your peripheral chemoreceptors really do not have that big of a role. They don't kick in until PO2 decreases to about 50% of normal values. Okay, so again, they're there, they kick in only in very severe conditions. The peripheral mechanoreceptors, these are the stretch receptors that are found in the lung tissue. As we inhale, you're stimulating those stretch receptors, and those are going to send an impulse, okay, to prevent the overinflation of lungs, okay, to stop the inhalation process. And that reflex is known as the inflation or the Herring-Brewer reflex. We have not talked about the central chemoreceptors. Was it skipped? It was. Okay, so your central chemoreceptors, those are the chemoreceptors that are found that monitor the changes of pH in the CSF, and these are the ones that are the most important. They monitor pressures of carbon dioxide, and they monitor the pH levels. Okay, these are the ones that really affect breathing rates. Okay, since hydrogen has no ability of crossing the blood-brain barrier, okay, what happens is, again, the carbon dioxide combines with water to make carbonic acid, or H2CO3. Carbonic acid then breaks down into hydrogen and bicarb. Okay, so this is how the hydrogen levels are established, or how hydrogen reaches the CSF in the surrounding the brain and surrounding the spinal cord. Okay, so it's that pH levels and the levels of the partial pressure of carbon dioxide that are going to stimulate the central chemoreceptors in order to breathe faster. So when there are high levels of CO2 and high levels of hydrogen ion, which you could also kind of translate into low pH levels, that is going to stimulate the process of breathing. So these individuals are going to be breathing faster. Okay. My apologies, I skipped that one slide, but the central chemoreceptors are the most important in the whole process of how we control breathing. So you got central chemoreceptors that monitor the CO2 and hydrogen levels. Peripheral chemoreceptors, those monitor your pressure of oxygen. Again, those don't kick in until PO2 levels go less than 50%. And then the peripheral mechanoreceptors, those are responsible for that inflation reflex stimulated by the stretch of the lung tissue. So what are the factors that affect breathing? As I said, there's a stretch of tissue, okay, that is going to stimulate the inflation reflex that we talked about. Low levels of PO2, those are going to stimulate the chemoreceptors in the carotid and the aortic bodies. High plasma levels of CO2 or hydrogen levels in the CSF. And then again, those are going to stimulate the chemoreceptors that are the central chemoreceptors that are found in the CNS. All three of these stimulate breathing, okay? The stretch of tissue is the only one that inhibits inspiration. So a little correlation kind of between the relationship between exercise and breathing. So we all know that when we exercise, we are in need of increasing our breathing rates. And that is in order to get more oxygen into the body and to get rid of all of that carbon dioxide that is being produced by the skeletal muscles. So in order to do that, there are different things that help us start breathing faster even before we actually exercise. So there's the cerebral cortex. So just knowing that you're going to exercise, that is going to stimulate the respiratory centers to increase breathing rates, okay, as it is sending signals to the skeletal muscles to contract. So it'll send signals to your skeletal muscles to start exercise, and at the same time, send impulses to the diaphragm to start contracting faster. Okay, our joints are going to be sending proprioception information to your CNS, and that is also going to stimulate the respiratory centers. Okay, shortness of breath that happens during exercise is usually due to something going on in the cardiovascular system. The lungs are kind of able to accommodate the increase in respiration. So the shortness of breath, again, is typically due to a cardiovascular system, not because the cardiovasculars may be unable to keep up with the need, and it's less probably due to respiratory. Now we have not talked about the alveolar gas exchange at the alveolar level. So this right here is a alveolus, okay, with these little pores. These pores are normal so that air can kind of flow in between the alveoli. Alveoli also have macrophages, and macrophages are there to eat up any pathogens, okay, by phagocytosis. And in order for oxygen or carbon dioxide to diffuse, it has to diffuse through what is known as the respiratory membrane. Okay, we want to take a look at the breakdown of what the respiratory membrane is. There are two different kinds of cells that are found there. We have the simple squamous epithelium, and that is the type 1 cell, The type 2 cells, those are the cells that make pulmonary surfactant. Okay, so your respiratory membrane has, and I want to kind of go to the picture to see this. This right here is the air sac. Okay, this pinkish part is the alveolus or the air sac, and this is the capillary with the red blood cell. And the oxygen has to diffuse from the alveolus here all the way into the red blood cell. So it has to pass through all of these membranes. And this right here is a bigger picture where you can see the simple squamous epithelium of the alveolus with its basement membrane, so that darker yellow that you see. And then there is the interstitial tissue in between, and then the simple squamous epithelium of the capillary and its basement membrane. Okay, so the respiratory membrane is made out of all of these different layers. So again, your alveolar wall, the simple squamous epithelium with its basement membrane, and then the blood capillary wall, made out of simple squamous as well with its basement membrane. So we already talked about the basement membrane of both. Okay. So again, the oxygen and carbon dioxide has to diffuse through all of these different layers. If for any reason this membrane, this respiratory membrane, is thicker than normal, so for example, maybe pneumonia or emphysema or any other disease, pulmonary disease, that is going to lead to harder diffusion. It's going to make it harder for oxygen and carbon dioxide to diffuse because now it has to diffuse through a bigger respiratory membrane. When diffusion happens, if you guys remember from the very start of the course when we talked about simple diffusion, it would always happen from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. And that is the process of diffusion that's going to happen here. So this upper portion represents the alveolus or the air sac, and this lower portion represents the capillary in the lungs. So this is the deoxygenated blood, or the oxygen that does not have the blood that does not have oxygen in it. And then it'll go through the capillary where it gets oxygenated and it leaves on the opposite side. Now you can see, you don't have to worry about the numbers, but I am going to talk about them to help understand how these partial pressures and the difference in these pressures help in the process of diffusion. So the air sac has a partial pressure of oxygen of 104, while the blood coming in, the venous blood coming in, has a pressure of oxygen of 40. So according to the laws of diffusion, oxygen is going to diffuse from the alveolus into the capillary. While carbon dioxide, if you look at those numbers, the PCO2 is 45 in the capillary, while in the alveolus it's only 40. So again, according to the laws of diffusion, PCO2 is going to diffuse from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. And that process is going to keep on going, whether it's the diffusion of oxygen or diffusion of carbon dioxide, until they are equal. So you see here, as blood is leaving the lungs, CO2 and oxygen levels are exactly the same as they are in the alveolus. So they have to reach that state of equilibrium before it leaves the alveolus. Okay, and that driving force for diffusion to occur is the difference in those partial pressures. Now a little bit about the effects of high altitude. So if anybody has been in an area that is way above sea level, okay, the higher altitudes have lower atmospheric pressure. Okay, although the amount of oxygen is still the same. It's the pressure that has changed, and that decrease in pressure makes it harder to breathe. So that is, some people experience what is known as altitude sickness, where there is an increase in breathing rates, increase of heart rate, and if you stay there for a long period of time, that can even lead to the increased production of RBCs and hemoglobin to kind of compensate for that low atmospheric pressure. Okay, HAPE, or high altitude pulmonary edema, This is a very severe form of altitude sickness that could lead to, as you can see from the name, pulmonary edema. So there is swelling in the lungs. It leads to severe headache, nausea, vomiting, tachycardia, and tachypnea, which is rapid breathing rates, and it can even lead to cyanosis, where now the patient starts turning blue. Now, disorders that impair gas exchange. So pneumonia, and we kind of talked about that a little bit when we talked about the respiratory membrane. Pneumonia is basically an infection in the lung tissue where there is a thickening of the respiratory membrane, and that is going to make it harder for the for oxygen and carbon dioxide to diffuse. The alveoli can now be full of even inflammatory fluids, white blood cells, germs, and whatever kind of pathogen that was in there. And all of that, again, is going to increase the thickness of the respiratory membrane and make it harder to diffuse, for gases to diffuse. Tuberculosis is a bacterial lung infection, where there are lots of different little tubercles that are basically connective tissue scattered throughout the lung tissue. And again, in order for the body to kind of control the formation of tubercles, it surrounds it with a fibrous wall. And that fibrous wall leads to obviously destruction of the lung tissue, and again, thickening of the respiratory membrane. Atelectasis, that's a collapse of the lung tissue. So in case of obstruction, so let's say something has obstructed the bronchi and air is no longer able to get in. So that now the alveoli are going to collapse. And that leads to the collapse of the blood vessels as well. And now we have added to the dead space. No air getting into one part of the lungs, no blood getting there either. So there is no exchange of gas in an area, and that is what is known as atelectasis or lung collapse. So gas transport, which again is the function of the respiratory system, a function of the cardiovascular, but we will talk about how do we transport oxygen and carbon dioxide between the lung and the blood cells. Sometimes these gases can just dissolve in plasma, or they can combine chemically with other chemicals, with other substances. So we'll talk about oxygen first. Oxygen can be transported in two different ways. The majority of oxygen is bound to hemoglobin that is found in your red blood cells. Just a little tiny bit of oxygen, so 1 to 2% of oxygen, can be dissolved directly into blood plasma. That hemoglobin molecule has 4 arms, and it also has a molecule of iron. Those 4 arms, each arm has the ability to attach to an oxygen molecule. So each hemoglobin can bind to 4 molecules of oxygen. Hemoglobin is that bond between oxygen and hemoglobin is very unstable. So as soon as it reaches tissue that has low oxygen levels, it is going to let go of that oxygen. So it makes it easy for oxygen to let go of hemoglobin and move into the tissue. And when that happens, each hemoglobin molecule that is attached to 4 oxygen does not let go of all 4 of those. It usually lets go of just 1 molecule. So hemoglobin, as it's leaving, in the venous blood, it is 75% saturated with oxygen. So it only let go of 1 of the 4 oxygen molecules. Again, the partial pressures play a role here. So this right here represents your alveolus, and this down here represents the tissue cells. As the oxygenated blood is going to reach your tissue, the difference in partial pressures in oxygen and carbon dioxide favors diffusion of oxygen into the tissue and diffusion of carbon dioxide from the tissue to the red blood cell. And then all of that now deoxygenated blood is going to be carried over to the lungs, where exchange of gas happens in the opposite direction. So the exchange of gas that happens in the lungs, that's known as external respiration, while the exchange of gas that happens in the tissue is known as internal respiration. Now, how is it that I can increase the release of oxygen from hemoglobin? So hemoglobin is basically a chemical that does not have a brain. It cannot see that now I'm in the tissue, I have to let go of oxygen. So what are the clues for hemoglobin to let go of its oxygen? Okay, so when it reaches tissue that has a low pressure, partial pressure of oxygen, so a decrease in PO2, when it reaches tissue that has too much carbon dioxide, so increase in PCO2, which again, kind of translates into increase in acidity, and I'm going to let you guys answer this. So how is the pH changing? Or areas with increased body temperature. So if you have an inflammation in an area of the body, this area of inflammation is going to be warmer than the rest of your body, and that again is going to help hemoglobin let go of extra oxygen in that inflamed tissue. Now, what about transport of carbon dioxide? Well, carbon dioxide is a metabolite that we have to get rid of. Carbon dioxide is transported in 3 ways. Okay, we can dissolve carbon dioxide in plasma. It can also bind to hemoglobin and it'll make carbaminohemoglobin. The majority is transported in this way. Okay, so that infamous reaction that we've talked about, carbon dioxide will combine with water to make carbonic acid, and then that will break down into H and HCO3. So this is really the main way how we carry carbon dioxide, how it is transported. Now that process, okay, that equation that we talked about happens inside of the red blood cell. Okay, when this RBC reaches the lungs, this reaction will go backwards. We will make carbon dioxide again, and then carbon dioxide will diffuse into the lungs. Okay, so you can see kind of in this picture the 3 different ways to carry carbon dioxide, either dissolved in plasma or combined with hemoglobin to make carbaminohemoglobin, or this reaction that we just talked about. It's a reversible reaction. So as it leaves the tissue, it is leaving as HCO3 and hydrogen. When we get to the lungs, this reaction goes backwards and we make the carbon dioxide again that can diffuse into the air sac. You can see here that in the tissue, this bicarbonate is going to leave the red blood cell, okay, and go into the bloodstream. Because it's a negative ion, we have to get a negative ion in return, and that would be chloride, and that process is known as a chloride shift. So here you can see the red blood cell getting rid of the bicarb and taking chloride. That again processes a chloride shift where there's an exchange of these 2 negative ions. The red blood cell will take chloride in exchange for HCO3. Now, as we mentioned already, when the RBC reaches the alveolus, this bicarb is going to enter into the RBC again. We will reverse that whole reaction and produce carbon dioxide again. That carbon dioxide will diffuse into the alveolus, and the oxygen is going to take, the RBC is going to take oxygen and become oxygenated. So these are the different gases in the body. So oxygen, most of it is combined with hemoglobin, with the iron in the hemoglobin molecule, and that we call that oxyhemoglobin, or it's just in plasma and we just call it regular oxygen. Carbon dioxide has 3 different ways. Either carbon dioxide is just dissolved in plasma, or it attaches to hemoglobin, and that is known as carbaminohemoglobin, while the majority reacts with water to make carbonic acid, and then that dissociates. So we carry carbon dioxide in the form of bicarbonate ions. Now, for the lifespan changes that happen to the respiratory system, okay, it is very variable depending on, the person, if he or she smokes, depending on where they live and their exposure, occupational exposure, and exposure to pollution and so on. But these are the changes that tend to occur, that the ciliated epithelium tend to become less in number. The cilia becomes paralyzed and less active with thickening of mucus. The reflexes, the swallowing, gagging, and coughing reflexes, those tend to slow down. Macrophages tend to become less efficient. There's an increase of respiratory tract infections as we age. Okay, there's also breathing can become more laborious or harder to occur because of the stiffening of the cartilages in the ribs, the costal cartilages, and due to changes in posture. So with the bending over as we age, that kind of change in posture, that is going to affect the ability to breathe as well. And the connective tissue, the muscles in the bronchioles, those smooth muscles, are going to gradually be replaced with connective tissue and make it harder to breathe. The bronchial walls become thinner and they don't open as much as we inhale. And then there's going to be thinning and loss of elasticity in the alveolar walls, and they start to merge together, and that will lead to decrease in the gas exchange area. And this concludes the respiratory system.